The morning begins with a brightness that doesn't match the mood inside the Red Willow County Justice Center. Sunlight spills across the frost-rimmed steps, but everyone walking toward the building moves with the hushed caution of people who know something heavy is about to break open. A cold wind sweeps across Maple Crossing, carrying the faint chemical scent from the tire plant a mile away. It drifts through the parking lot as officers gather near an unmarked door, their breaths visible in thin clouds. On the other side of the concrete wall, a man sits alone in a small room. His hands are clasped loosely in front of him, wrists resting on the metal tabletop as if he's waiting for a routine appointment instead of the moment his life collapses. The fluorescent light above casts a pale wash across his face, softening the lines around his eyes, making him look almost gentle. That gentleness is what unsettles the detectives watching through the glass. It's too familiar, too ordinary, too close to the version of him the community has known for decades. A ring of keys rests on the table beside him. Not many, just 5 metal pieces on a dull silver loop, but the sound they made when he set them down has not left the room. It was a crisp, confident jingle, the kind made by someone accustomed to carrying access. Someone who walked into places most people needed permission for. Someone trusted. No one speaks yet. The stillness is so complete that the whir of the air vent feels loud. A folder lies closed in front of the lead detective, though the entire team already knows what is inside. The DNA match report, the genealogical breakdown, the photographs of victims' homes that were supposed to be unconnected. All the quiet threads that finally tied themselves around one man's name. He looks calm. Too calm. His foot taps lightly against the leg of the chair, not from nerves but from habit, the absent-minded rhythm of someone who spent years walking hallways, checking boilers, tightening door hinges, replacing locks without anyone questioning why. His work boots still carry a faint dusting of salt from the morning frost, leaving small white marks on the floor beneath him. A soft knock breaks the tension, and the door opens. Detective Mara Ellison steps inside, carrying the brown evidence envelope that started everything. She doesn't place it on the table immediately. Instead, she studies the man for a long moment, searching for a sign: guilt, fear, denial. But his expression remains unreadable, the same blank friendliness neighbors recalled when they described him. Helpful, quiet, polite. When she finally sits, the envelope rustles gently. The man's eyes flick toward it, then back to her. He doesn't ask what it is. Some part of him already knows. Mara pulls out a photograph and sets it down. It is simple. A key hook, empty, mounted beside a back door in a small kitchen. In the image, the afternoon light filters across the wall, highlighting the bare wooden pegs where keys once hung. He stares at it. A muscle in his jaw moves, tightens, then stops. Mara places a second photograph beside the first. A chipped blue coffee mug sitting on an evidence table, tagged and dated. Another item that had gone missing so many years ago that the original victim no longer remembered the exact day she realized it was gone. The mug had reappeared weeks ago in a locked cabinet in his garage, wrapped carefully in cloth as if it were something fragile or sacred. His breathing shifts, almost imperceptibly. The detectives watching from behind the glass exchange glances. No confession yet, no words at all, but the subtle sag of his shoulders reveals something loosening. Not remorse, something else. The quiet acceptance of a man who believed he would never be found, now realizing he was wrong. Mara slides the final document onto the table. The DNA match confirmation glows faintly under the fluorescent light. Numbers, alleles, probability brackets. Cold, clinical proof that ties him to a night he thought he had erased with routine and normalcy. For the first time, he looks away. Outside, a gust of wind sweeps across the courthouse lawn, shaking the last dried leaves from the oak trees. A woman walking her dog pauses, sensing a strange heaviness in the air, though she doesn't know why. Across town, commuters fill diner booths, their conversations drifting freely. unaware that the quiet maintenance man who once fixed their door frames is now sitting in a locked room with no certain future. Inside the interview room, Mara folds her hands calmly. Her voice, when she speaks, carries no anger, only certainty sharpened by 30 years of unanswered questions. "You know why you're here." His reply is delayed, barely audible, the smallest crack in an otherwise impenetrable calm. "I figured it would come eventually." The keys on the table tremble slightly as his fingers brush against them. The sound they make is soft but unmistakable, a faint reminder of every hallway he walked, every door he opened, every home he entered long before the nights that would later define him. Mara gathers the documents slowly, each movement deliberate. She stands, and when the officers enter to take him to processing, he doesn't resist. He rises with a quiet exhale, as if finally unburdened by the secret he carried through the ordinary rhythms of Maple Crossing. As the door closes behind him, the cold case room down the hall sits illuminated by a single overhead bulb. Files that sat untouched for decades now lie open in fresh stacks, marked with new notes, new connections, new hope. The truth has begun to surface, piece by piece, key by key. To understand how this began, we go back to 1992. For most people in Maple Crossing, life followed a gentle, steady rhythm. For Alina Park, that rhythm had always been a comfort. She was 24, but carried herself with the quiet focus of someone older, someone who knew where she wanted to go, even if she wasn't entirely sure how to get there. Her apartment sat above a florist shop on the corner of Larch and Burn, a small place with creaking floorboards and wide windows that let in the morning light. The kitchen was barely big enough for two people to stand side by side, but she loved the way the sun warmed the tiled floor each morning while she brewed her first cup of coffee. She split her time between graduate classes at Red Willow Community, college, and evening shifts at the Blue Fern Diner. The weeks blurred into a rhythm she found comforting. Early classes, afternoons in the library, evenings serving regulars who always asked about her thesis before ordering the same meals they'd been eating for years. She wore her hair in a loose ponytail most days and kept a small silver ring around her neck on a chain. It wasn't expensive, just something her little brother gave her when she left home for college. She touched it without thinking whenever she was stressed. Her apartment reflected her habits in small, almost tender details. On the counter sat a cracked ceramic bowl she used for her keys, a gift from her roommate 3 years ago, long before she moved out. A stack of textbooks leaned against a potted fern she kept forgetting to water. Letters from her mother were tucked into a corkboard above her desk, each one ending the same way. "Do your best, but don't forget to rest." Elena had been trying to learn how to rest for most of her life. Balancing studies with long shifts was tiring, but she rarely complained. When classmates joked about how she seemed powered by determination alone, she laughed along but didn't correct them. Determination was easier to admit than the truth that she felt a quiet pressure to build the future her parents had sacrificed so much for. Still, she found joy in small pockets of her days. On Sundays, she met her friend Kelsey at the farmer's market, where they sampled honey sticks and bought more vegetables than either of them could cook. She took walks along the Red Willow River, breathing in the earthy scent rising from the banks after a rainstorm. She kept a journal filled with quotes, ideas, and the occasional hastily scribbled poem she never showed anyone. These were the soft corners of her life, places she didn't share easily but carried close to her chest. Her co-workers at the diner described her as both reserved and warm, a combination that made customers feel comfortable even if they didn't know much about her. She remembered regulars' orders without trying, asked after their families, and often slipped extra napkins to the elderly couple who frequently spilled coffee. People liked her naturally, without effort. There were shadows in her life too, though she never spoke about them. She lived alone. She worked late shifts, and she never quite shook the feeling common among young women living on their own, that she had to be cautious. She kept her phone charger by the bed, double-checked the lock each night, and hung her keys on a small ceramic hook by the back door. A leaf-shaped hook celadon green, chipped at the corner. She'd bought it at a craft fair months earlier, drawn to it for reasons she couldn't quite name. It had become one of her rituals, unlocking the door, stepping inside, hanging her keys, exhaling. That moment always felt like the day's true ending. Friends knew her dreams, even if she didn't state them outright. She wanted to finish her thesis on community mental health outreach. She wanted to work somewhere that made a difference, somewhere she could help people navigate the parts of life no one admitted were overwhelming. Her advisor admired her diligence but encouraged her to slow down, reminding her she had time. She nodded politely during those meetings, even though time often felt like the one thing she didn't have enough of. A few days before everything changed, Elena's life felt quieter than usual. Midterms were over, the diner was in a lull before the holiday crowds, and the early November chill had settled across Maple Crossing. She wore her red scarf everywhere, a Christmas gift from her aunt the previous year. Her cheeks flushed easily in the cold, making her look younger, more carefree, even when she was weighed down by notes and essays. On one of those cold days, she ran into her neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, an older woman who lived on the first floor and often checked on her. They stood in the stairwell discussing the upcoming winter storm. Mrs. Donnelly insisted Elena take a spare battery-powered lantern just in case the power flickered out during the night. Elena accepted it reluctantly, thinking she probably wouldn't need it, but grateful all the same. It was the kind of small kindness that helped define Maple Crossing, a town where people still looked after each other, even if they didn't share much of their private lives. Elena's last full day followed the same pattern as many before it. She woke to the sound of cars passing below her window, the morning fog still clinging to the street. She made oatmeal with cinnamon and honey, brewed her coffee, and read through her class notes while standing at the counter. She worked a short shift at the diner, laughing with coworkers, wiping down the stainless steel counter, and thanking the cook for covering her weekend shift so she could study. In the afternoon, she walked along the river path despite the cold. The water moved slowly, carrying long reflections of bare branches. She sat on a bench and sketched the outline of a tree leaning over the bank. Art wasn't her strength, but she liked how drawing forced her to slow her breath. When her phone buzzed, it was her brother checking in. Their messages were short but affectionate. He promised to visit during winter break. She told him she missed him. He replied with a picture of the family dog wearing a sweater. Later that evening, she returned to her apartment, grocery bag in one hand, scarf loosely wrapped around her neck. She paused outside her building, noticing the florist downstairs had set out a new arrangement of winter flowers, white chrysanthemums and evergreen branches. She reached out to touch one of the blooms, surprised at how cold the petals felt against her fingers. At home, she cooked a simple meal, played soft music from her laptop, and graded a few discussion posts for her teaching assistant role. The apartment felt warm, peaceful, held together by familiar routines. She tidied her desk, watered the ferns she kept forgetting, and rearranged her textbooks into neat stacks. For a moment, she felt the rare calm of everything in its place. Around 10, she called her mother. They spoke about mundane things, the weather, her brother's classes, the rising price of groceries. Her mother asked if she was eating enough, sleeping enough, pacing herself. Elena brushed off the concerns, trying not to worry her. Before hanging up, her mother said, "Don't forget to lock the door tonight." The news said it'll be windy. Elena promised she would. After the call, she washed her dishes, wiped the counters, and prepared her clothes for the next day. She placed her keys on the green ceramic hook by the back door, the motion automatic and reassuring. The apartment settled into its nighttime quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the heater and the distant whistle of wind moving across the rooftops. She didn't know it, but this was the last ordinary night she would ever have. Nothing felt unusual, nothing warned her. Life simply breathed out, steady and familiar, unaware of what waited in the shadows beyond that calm. For most of Maple Crossing, the night that changed everything passed without notice. A low ceiling of clouds pressed down over Red Willow County, muting the stars and softening the orange glow of the streetlights. The florist below Elena's apartment had gone dark hours earlier, its windows reflecting only the occasional passing car and the ghostly outlines of empty buckets stacked inside. In the small space above, Elena's world had quieted in its usual way. Shortly after 11, she rinsed her mug in the sink, set it on the counter with a faint ring of tea still clinging to the bottom, and walked the short hallway to her bedroom. She checked her alarm twice. She meant to hang her keys on the green ceramic hook by the back door, but fatigue tugged her in another direction. Without thinking, she set them on the bedside table beside her book and slid under the covers. The heater clicked and hummed in gentle intervals. Outside, the wind moved through the narrow alley behind the building, carrying the damp smell of leaves and exhaust. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. At 11:42 p.m., a figure stepped into that alley. No one would later remember seeing a stranger there. The alley was used mostly by tenants and delivery drivers. It held no cameras, no obvious vantage point for witnesses. The security light above the neighbor's back door flickered sporadically, sometimes bright, sometimes dull, as if unsure whether to hold the darkness back or let it in. The back steps leading to Lena's door were slick with a thin sheen of moisture. The paint on the railing flaked under a gloved hand. At the top of the stairs, the intruder paused just long enough to listen. From inside came no music, no television, no conversation. Only the intermittent sigh of the heater and the slow tick of a cheap wall clock. The deadbolt and handle lock on Elena's back door were relatively new. The landlord had installed them when she moved in, after she insisted on something more secure than the worn latch that came before. There were no cracks in the frame, no pry marks, nothing to suggest that anyone could break their way inside without making a mess. The door did not break. There was only the small, precise sound of metal aligning with metal, a key sliding into a lock it had been cut to fit. From the alley, no one heard the door unlatch. The building absorbed the sound easily. Inside, a sliver of colder air crept along the kitchen floor as the intruder stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind with practiced care. The weak light from a nearby street lamp filtered through the back window, drawing a pale rectangle across the linoleum and the cracked ceramic bowl by the counter where Elena normally dropped her keys at the end of the day. The bowl was empty. The hook beside the door was bare. The intruder stood still for a moment, letting the room settle around him. He moved the way people do when they know a space. No fumbling, no hesitation. Past the small table with open class notes, past the fern slumped in its pot, past the couch with a blanket folded over one arm. He knew the hallway was short, that the bedroom door would be half closed. He knew where the bathroom was, where the light switch sat, how many steps it took to cross from one end of the apartment to the other. In the bedroom, the lamp still burned at a low setting. Elena lay on her side, one hand near her necklace, the other resting beside the book that had slid toward the edge of the mattress. Her breathing was even, unguarded. The room smelled faintly of laundry soap and the floral trace that drifted up from the shop below. What followed belonged to her statements, to medical records, to quiet conversations in the days afterward. She would later speak of waking to a pressure she didn't understand at first, of a hand and a voice, low, controlled, demanding silence, of feeling her own home shrink, walls moving inward, the distance between the bed and the door suddenly impossible. She would talk about commands, about bindings, about being forced to move where she did not want to go. Those details would be recorded carefully and sparingly, preserved for courtrooms and case files. Between midnight and 1 a.m., sounds escaped the edges of that closed room. A neighbor above would recall hearing a dull something hitting the floor. Another, on the first floor, would remember a muffled noise she took for a dropped box. No one called the police. In Maple Crossing, Odd sounds late at night still belonged, in most people's minds, to harmless explanations. At 1:17 a.m., water began running through the pipes. In her apartment, Mrs. Donnelly paused mid-sentence while reading a book, listening to the vibration through the wall behind her headboard. She thought briefly of noisy students and shook it off, turning the page. Upstairs, water struck tile, pooled briefly, and circled the drain. By 1:46 a.m., the building had gone still. The heater cycled on. The alley grew quiet again. When the back door opened a second time, the act was as smooth and unremarkable as before. The lock accepted the key without protest. Footsteps descended the stairs, fading into the soft scrape of shoes on wet concrete. The security light buzzed once and steadied, sending a weak circle of yellow over the now empty steps. Morning crept in gray and chilly. Delivery trucks braked and hissed at the curb. The florist rolled up the metal security gate with a clatter and filled the shop with the smell of wet stems and fertilizer. Above, the blinds in Elena's windows remained closed. At 7:50 a.m., Kelsey glanced at the clock inside the Blue Fern diner and felt the first ripple of unease. Elena was due at 8. Most days, she slipped through the door early, cheeks flushed from the walk, scarf trailing a faint coldness into the warm air of the diner. By 8 sharp, with plates stacking up and coffee pouring, there was still no sign of her. "She text you?" the cook asked. Kelsey shook her head. "No, that's weird." She tried to make excuses in her mind. Maybe the alarm failed. Maybe she'd woken up sick. Maybe she'd decided to skip the shift to finish a paper, though that wasn't like her. Between orders, she wiped her hands and reached for her phone. At 8:06, she dialed Elena's number. It rang until the voicemail message anonymous and bland cut in. She hung up, dialed again at 8:15, then 8:27. Each time, the sound on the other end carried a strange, hollow quality, as if ringing into a room only half awake. By 8:45, the manager nodded toward the front. "I need you out there," he said, sensing her distraction. "Try her again on your break, all right?" She agreed, but the anxious pressure in her chest didn't ease. When a brief lull came closer to 9, she stepped outside into the alley behind the diner, the cold air burning her lungs. This time she didn't call Elena directly. She called the one person who always seemed to know whether the building was all right. "Mrs. Donnelly, it's Kelsey from the diner. I'm sorry to bother you. Have you seen Elena this morning?" On the other end, Mrs. Donnelly listened, looking up toward the ceiling as if she could hear the apartment above. "No, dear. I haven't. Her curtains were still closed when I took the trash out. Is everything okay?" "She never came in," Kelsey said. "She's not picking up. I don't know, it just feels wrong." "Let me go check," Mrs. Donnelly replied. "I'll call you back." A few minutes later, she was climbing the narrow back stairs, fingers brushing the cold rail. The building smelled like old wood and faint cooking oil. She reached Elena's door and knocked. The sound echoed deeper than she expected. "Elena?" she called. "It's Mrs. Donnelly. You all right, honey?" Silence. She knocked harder, listening for any movement beyond the hollow thud of her own hand. She tried the knob. The deadbolt held. She knew Elena well enough to know that was both reassuring and troubling. Locked from the inside or out, it meant nothing by itself. But combined with silence, it put a sharp edge on her concern. She went back downstairs to call the landlord. He arrived shortly after 9, muttering about students and their sleep habits, a ring of keys hanging at his hip. His tone was casual, but his pace on the stairs quickened as Mrs. Donnelly described the unanswered calls, the quiet apartment, the feeling she couldn't shake. He knocked once out of habit, then slid the master key into the lock. It turned smoothly. When he pushed the door open, warm, slightly stale air drifted out. No radio, no television, no music. Just stillness. The kitchen looked untouched at first glance. The mug sat on the counter, its crescent of dried tea visible against the porcelain. The chair at the small table was pushed back from its place, not much, just enough to suggest someone standing in a hurry. A notebook lay open, lines of handwriting frozen mid-thought. The green ceramic hook by the back door was empty. "Elena?" he called. "It's Dan. We're coming in, okay?" There was no answer. He moved cautiously toward the living room. Mrs. Donnelly stayed closer to the door, eyes sweeping over every small detail. One of Elena's shoes rested near the coffee table. The other lay half-turned near the hallway. The rug bore a faint, irregular mark, like something heavy had shifted across it and then been set right again. At the bathroom door, the landlord hesitated. The tile floor inside was still faintly damp. A towel lay in a loose heap. The mirror above the sink held a ghost of condensation across its lower edge, as if steam had lingered there not long ago. He called her name again as he pushed the bedroom door open. Elena was on the far side of the bed, wrapped tightly in a blanket. She was not unconscious, but her gaze was distant, fixed on a spot that seemed to exist somewhere beyond the room. When she registered movement at the door, her shoulders jerked, and she pulled the blanket closer around herself. Breathing quick and shallow, Mrs. Donnelly's voice, calm but urgent, came from the hall. "Don't touch anything. Call an ambulance." The next hour unfolded in a series of efficient, overlapping motions. Paramedics arrived and moved through the apartment with quiet purpose, speaking low and steady, asking permission, explaining each step. Elena answered their questions in fragments. Yes, she could stand. Yes, she wanted to go to the hospital. No, she didn't want to stay in the apartment. She clutched the edge of the blanket all the way to the door. Police officers followed, marking the threshold with yellow tape, writing the first entries in a log that would grow thick over the years. A crime scene unit arrived with boxes and cameras and gloves. They began at the entrance, working inward. Photographs of the back door, close-ups of the lock and surrounding frame, measurements of distances and angles. The absence of disturbance to the door itself became the first notable detail. In the kitchen, they documented the mug, the bowl, the open notebook. Each object was logged with its precise position. The mug and bowl were collected, bagged, and labeled. Fibers were lifted from the hallway rug in the bedroom. The towel in the bathroom was placed into a separate bag. A stray hair near the drain was taken carefully with tweezers and sealed. The technician examining the lock checked the wood and metal with practiced eyes. No pry marks, he noted for the record. No splintering, no fresh scratches on the cylinder. Door appears to have been opened with a key or other proper mechanism. Another technician photographed the empty hook above the bowl. It seemed unimportant at first, a decorative detail with nothing to contribute. But its mention would later recur in interviews. Friends and co-workers would say that Elena always hung her keys there, that it was one of her habits, that seeing the hook empty felt instantly wrong. At the hospital, a specially trained nurse met Elena with practiced gentleness. Forms were signed. Clothes were collected as evidence. Swabs were taken with clinical precision, placed into carefully labeled tubes, and handed off to an officer who logged each one with time and chain of custody. The process was invasive, exhausting, necessary. When detectives spoke to Elena later that day, they sat in a quiet room away from the noise of the emergency department. She described what she could. Waking to a presence, a hand. The smell of something artificial, like latex or cleaning fluid. A voice that kept low, never raising above a controlled murmur. She had not seen a clear face. She believed the person knew where things were in her apartment, where the light switches were, which way the bedroom door swung, how to find the bathroom in the dark. "Did you give anyone a spare key?" A detective asked gently. "No," she said, "just the one. I keep it by the door. I always keep it there. Anyone been in your apartment for repairs lately? Maintenance, landlord, plumber?" She closed her eyes, trying to sort through months of ordinary days. "Not that I remember," she said finally. "If they did, I would have been here." Back at the apartment, the evidence technicians packed up their final bags. The late afternoon light had turned the alley dull and colorless. The officers sealing the door felt the same familiar frustration that comes with a scene that refuses to explain itself. On the initial report, the detectives listed what they had: a survivor, a locked apartment, signs of struggle, trace biological evidence, no clear suspect. They noted the lack of forced entry, the intact lock, the absence of a spare key. One detail sat alone on a separate line, underlined in the margin, as if someone didn't want it to be lost among the rest. Victim habitually hangs keys on hook by back door. Hook empty at time of discovery. No key located on scene. It was small, almost trivial on its own. But in the larger pattern that would emerge over the next 15 years, that empty hook, that missing key, and that undamaged lock would become the quiet center of a question Maple Crossing wasn't yet ready to ask. Who in this town had a key to other people's lives? And how long had he been using it? The first weeks after the attack brought urgency, long hours, and the kind of focused determination that often follows a crime that unsettles an entire community. Two detectives, Mark Roswell and Dana Eccles, took the lead. They combed through Elena's account again and again, hoping repetition might reveal something they had missed. But her memory was fractured by fear and darkness, defined more by sensations than images. A hand, a hushed voice, the certainty that the intruder knew the apartment. At first the case seemed solvable. They had biological evidence. They had a timeline. They had a survivor who was willing to talk. But the hope that accompanied those early days soon began to crumble under the weight of each dead end. The first suspect emerged when a neighbor mentioned a man seen wandering near the alley weeks prior. He was described as tall, wearing dark clothes, carrying a backpack. The police tracked him down at a homeless shelter on the west side of town. They questioned him, collected a DNA sample, and waited. When the results came back negative, the detectives barely reacted. Disappointment had already become familiar. 2 weeks later, the landlord became the next focus, not because he seemed suspicious, but because he had access. "Keys don't just walk away," Roswell said, flipping through maintenance logs. They interviewed him 3 times. Each time he answered steadily and without defensiveness. He did not remember entering Elena's apartment recently. He denied making duplicates. His DNA did not match. "Someone had a key," Eccles said after the 3rd interview. "If it wasn't him, who else had access?" "A former tenant," Roswell suggested. "Someone who forgot to return it." "Or didn't forget," Eccles replied. They pulled old tenant records from the building. The stack of names and past addresses filled 2 binders. Detectives and patrol officers spent weeks knocking on doors across Red Willow County. Some former tenants remembered the key system. Most didn't. A few still had their copies and offered them reluctantly, surprised the police cared. But none of their stories matched the timeline, and none of their DNA samples connected to the crime. Elena tried to return to school in the middle of that first winter, but the attempt lasted only a few weeks. Each time she walked up the apartment stairs, her stomach tightened. She began jumping at sounds she once ignored, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. Friends offered to stay with her, but she didn't want to feel like a burden. Eventually, she moved to a small unit across town, closer to her mother. The cracked ceramic bowl stayed behind, packed away in evidence. Months passed, leads grew weaker. The holiday season arrived, and the police department was stretched thin with accidents and weather-related emergencies. DNA analysis moved slowly. The county lab had 3 technicians handling dozens of cases, and the backlog pushed even urgent samples into delays. When the results finally returned, the report came with the sentence detectives dread most: DNA profile suitable for comparison. No CODIS match. The intruder had no prior record. The case hovered in place, suspended between proof of harm and absence of identity. In spring, a new possibility surfaced. A security guard at the community college reported seeing a maintenance worker behaving oddly standing in the shadows, near student apartments long after his shift ended. The guard provided a name, and detectives arranged an interview. The man, a thin, nervous 29-year-old with a tendency to talk too fast, denied any connection to the attack, but admitted he often walked home through that same alley. He seemed suspicious, mostly because he seemed afraid. Detectives collected his DNA and waited again. Alina saw his photograph and said she didn't think it was him, but she wasn't certain. The results took 2 weeks, another negative. By that point, the case file had grown thick with interview notes, photos of empty rooms, and maps of the neighborhood. The green ceramic hook appeared in several pictures, circled in red marker by Eccles. "She always hung her keys here," she kept repeating. "Always. Then where are they now?" Roswell asked once, rubbing his temples. He had to take them. For what purpose? Eccles asked. Silence followed. They didn't know. Nothing about the crime made sense yet. Summer brought another stalled angle. A man in the next county arrested for trespassing after being found inside a woman's home while she slept. The details were uncanny late-night entry, no forced lock, victim asleep alone. Red Willow detectives drove out to interview him. He denied everything, his answers bordering on mocking. His alibi for the night of Elena's attack held. His DNA did not match. Back in Maple Crossing, time moved forward whether the case did or not. Alina withdrew from school for a semester. She spent more afternoons with her mother, occasionally walking the familiar streets, but avoiding the florist entirely. The sight of the shop window stirred something in her: fear, loss, a lingering shadow she couldn't swallow. Kelsey visited her often. Their conversations shifted from schoolwork to therapy appointments, from future plans to the exhausting process of rebuilding a sense of safety. Some days they laughed. Other days were quiet. The detectives felt the quiet too. The case weighed heavily on Eccles, who had taken personal responsibility for every failure. Roswell handled the external pressure better, but privately admitted to his partner that the case was starting to erode him. "It's like trying to solve a puzzle without corner pieces," he said during one late-night shift, staring at the evidence board. "Every time we get close, the picture changes. We're missing something," Eccles replied. "Something right in front of us." Her insistence never faded, but her leads increasingly did. A year after the crime, a similar assault occurred 30 miles away. Same pattern, night entry, no forced lock. Victim alone, biological evidence preserved. Detectives were hopeful. Perhaps this incident would reveal the link they needed. But that case also stalled. The DNA did not match anyone in CODIS. The lock showed no damage. The victim had no enemies, no recent visitors, no gifts of a spare key. She remembered waking to a whisper in the dark, a voice too calm for the violence that followed. The two departments compared notes. Patterns overlapped. But without a suspect or any physical evidence tying the cases to someone specific, the connection remained speculation. They could not prove the same man was responsible. They could not disprove it either. The media caught on briefly. A local paper published an article titled, "Is there a serial predator in Red Willow County?" The headline sparked fear and backlash. The police chief held a press conference urging calm and declining to confirm any connection. Muted conversations took place in grocery store aisles, church basements, and break rooms of the tire plant. Women began carrying pepper spray. Men began walking their partners to their cars. But as months passed without another incident, the community's vigilance softened, settling into the familiar lull that precedes forgetting. During the second year, the detectives revisited old suspects. A former boyfriend was questioned again. His timeline was clean. A delivery driver who made frequent rounds in the area denied entering any apartments. He was cleared. A neighbor whose window overlooked the alley reported seeing shadows, but nothing more specific. Eccles grew more irritable. Roswell paced more often, drinking too much coffee and too little water. The weight of unsolved harm made the days feel long and the nights even longer. In one meeting, Eccles dropped a stack of files onto the table. "There has to be something connecting these victims," she said. It's access. Access is the key. Roswell nodded, though he didn't say much. He stared at the photograph of Elena's empty key hook, the small green leaf shape that had become symbolic to both of them. It appeared in interview transcripts too often to feel meaningless. Maybe the key was never the target, he said finally. Maybe it was the tool. To what end? Eccles asked. He didn't know. 4 years in, the case remained open but stagnant. New leads arrived sporadically, often from people convinced they recognized something in the composite sketch or in the descriptions, but none of these panicked calls led anywhere. The sketch itself was generic, shaped by fear rather than memory. Budget cuts hit the department. Cold cases piled up. Roswell was assigned to other investigations. Eccles stayed attached but had fewer hours to devote. Both sensed the inevitability they'd been resisting. One day, Roswell found Eccles in the evidence room, staring at the sealed bags containing items from Elena's apartment. The mug, the bowl, the towel. The hair from the drain. The printouts of the empty key hook photos. It's been 4 years, he said quietly. I know, we've done what we can. Her jaw tightened. It isn't enough. It's all we have. She didn't argue because they both understood the painful truth behind his words. Cases like this didn't close because detectives stopped caring. They closed because time moved faster than answers. Resources shifted. People retired. Hope thinned. The official decision came at the end of the fiscal year. Not closed, just suspended. No further investigative leads at this time. The file was placed on a shelf with others like it. A thin layer of dust soon settled over the label. But Eccles wrote one final line at the bottom of her last report, just above her signature. Until we understand who had the key, we will never understand the crime. She boxed the evidence carefully, preserving every small detail for someone else. Someday, who might see what she could not. It would be 14 more years before anyone opened it again. Time moves quietly in Maple Crossing, the way snow begins to fall long before anyone notices the first flakes. In the years after the attack, Elena's life reshaped itself in slow, uneven motions, as if pulled by currents she could not always steer. She left the apartment above the florist, moved to a smaller place near her mother's house, and drifted away from campus life. Friends understood without fully understanding. There were things she could not explain, moments she could not speak about without feeling the air tighten around her. She tried to return to school more than once. The first attempt ended after a single semester, when the late-night walk from the library triggered something she couldn't shake. The second attempt lasted longer, but she found that concentration itself had become fragile, slipping through her fingers like cold river water. She eventually switched to part-time work at a community center, answering phones, helping with schedules, quietly managing tasks that kept her near people but not exposed to them. Her mother watched the changes with a kind of patient grief. In the early months, she wrote letters, simple things, not dramatic, not probing. They began the way all her letters did, asking about meals, sleep, the weather, the dog. But beneath every line was an unspoken wish that time might soften what had been taken. Each year she placed the letters into a fabric-covered box in her closet, the edges worn from being opened and closed. Elena's younger brother visited often during breaks. He tried to be lighthearted, joking about school, sending her photos of the new dog the family adopted, trying to anchor her to the present. But even he felt the distance growing. She had once been the sibling who planned everything: trips, birthdays, holiday dinners. After the attack, she lived more carefully, choosing predictability over possibility. He learned to follow her lead. Kelsey, ever loyal, stayed close. They met for coffee on weekends, sometimes at the diner where they once worked side by side. The conversations shifted over time. At first they revolved around fear, therapy, and the endless question of why. Later they turned toward gentler things, new recipes, small victories, job changes. But the case lived between them like a shadow in the corner of the room, acknowledged, respected, never fully banished. As seasons turned into years, Maple Crossing changed quietly around them. The tire plant expanded, drawing younger workers to town. The florist was sold to a new couple who repainted the storefront in brighter colors. College apartments were renovated with new locks and sturdier window frames. People who had lived in the same houses for decades grew older, slower, more cautious. Some moved away. Some passed on. The city council approved a community safety program. Streetlights were replaced. Alleyways were cleaned more frequently. But the fear that once gripped the town never fully left. It lingered in small behaviors, porch lights left on longer, curtains drawn earlier, neighbors who hesitated before opening their doors at night. No one talked about the case openly anymore, but it lived beneath every reminder of vulnerability. For the detectives, the years after the case was suspended brought their own quiet toll. Roswell transferred to the county's financial crimes unit. He worked efficiently and well, but colleagues noticed he spent long hours staring at the bulletin board in his new office, as though the cold case files had imprinted something on the back of his eyes. Eccles stayed in investigations for a time before taking a position at the academy teaching young officers. She carried copies of her old reports in a folder she rarely opened but never threw away. Every so often, when a crime in another town bore similarities to Elena's case, she would send the article to Roswell. The messages were brief, just a link or a line like, "You see this," and they never led anywhere. But neither of them stopped sending them. For Elena, life became a sequence of manageable days. She worked quietly at the community center, sometimes guiding children through art activities, sometimes organizing brochures for health programs. She developed a fondness for early mornings, when the town was barely awake and the world felt briefly safe. She walked the river path before work, always turning back at the same point. People greeted her gently, sensing a softness in her they did not quite understand. Her mother grew older. Her hair silvered at the temples. She developed a slight limp one winter after slipping on ice in the driveway. Elena spent more evenings cooking for her, bringing over soups and casseroles the way her mother once had for her. They talked often, but the case rarely surfaced. It hung silently in the spaces between conversation, tender and fragile. When Elena was in her early 30s, she moved again. This time to a townhouse at the edge of Red Willow County, near a stretch of farmland where the river curved west. She decorated it with pale colors, soft rugs, and plants that thrived better than the fern she once neglected. She kept her green ceramic key hook not at the back door this time, but beside her desk, no longer functional, but symbolic. A reminder of something she survived and something she left behind. Every December she mailed a handwritten card to Kelsey, always including a small pressed flower inside. Kelsey kept each one in a wooden box, tied with ribbon. Sometimes she opened the box when the nights grew long, rereading Elena's careful handwriting, wondering whether closure was still possible. A decade slipped past. The case aged in the storage room, stacked among others labeled suspended, their edges softening with time. The hair from the bathroom drain remained sealed in its evidence envelope. The mug and bowl were preserved in storage, their significance known only to the detectives who once held them under the fluorescent lights of the evidence room. By then, a new generation of officers patrolled Maple Crossing. Many of them had been children when the attack occurred. They heard fragments of the story through veterans who spoke of it in lowered voices, as if passing along a ghost story. Some officers remembered safety seminars in their youth where parents referenced the apartment case without naming it directly. Elena watched these young officers from a distance when she saw them downtown, marveling at how time reshaped everything. She wondered if any of them had read her file, or if they had walked past the evidence box unaware of the life tucked inside it. Her brother moved to another state for work. Her mother's health wavered. And Elena found herself aging without realizing it, her features softening, her gaze gaining depth, her voice steadying into something firmer, quieter. The world around her rebuilt itself, but parts of her remained anchored to a night she could not fully forget. Then, almost 20 years after the attack, a small change occurred that no one noticed at first. The county built a new crime lab, modest but efficient, with better equipment than the cramped room where Elena's samples were once processed. A young forensic biologist named Neera Vance joined the staff, full of energy and curiosity. She took an interest in cold cases, reading old files during lunch breaks, wondering how many answers lay waiting in outdated envelopes. One afternoon, while reorganizing the archive shelves, she came across a box labeled with a fading marker. Inside were the pieces of Elena's life that had been preserved for decades: the mug, the bowl, the towel, the swabs, the key hook photographs. She turned the mug over in her hands, tracing the slight indentation where a ring of tea had once dried. She set it down carefully and opened the evidence envelope that held the DNA samples. She studied the old label. The date read 1992. The sample quality notes were outdated, marked by limitations that no longer applied. She glanced toward the new sequencing machine humming at the far counter. It had processed samples older than this one. Much older. She returned the envelope to the box for the moment, but something had already taken root in her mind. A quiet question, a possibility. Maybe time had not erased everything. Maybe science had finally caught up to what had been lost. Maybe a name still lived inside the silent fragments sealed away for decades. She closed the box gently, but with intention. For the first time in years, the case shifted, just slightly, as if stirring from a long sleep. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The evidence box had been sealed for nearly 3 decades when Neera Vance set it down on the stainless steel bench inside the newly constructed Red Willow County Forensic Lab. Afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The quiet hum of machines filled the room, and somewhere deep within that low vibration was the promise of answers that once seemed impossible. Neera removed her gloves from the dispenser, slipping them on with practiced ease. She opened the lid carefully. Inside, everything had been arranged exactly as the previous generation of investigators left it. The mug, the cracked ceramic bowl, the sealed pouches containing fibers and swabs, the evidence envelope labeled Park 92, and a stack of notes that grew softer toward the edges with each passing year. One photograph caught her eye, the green ceramic key hook, circled in red ink. The hook was empty in the picture, small but oddly significant, as though it held the outline of a story no one had been able to read. She lifted the envelope containing the preserved DNA swabs. The paperwork stapled to the front listed the extraction attempts from the 90s, each one constrained by the technology of its era. The notes read insufficient for full profile and partial match to linked cases. Number CODIS entries. Neera traced the faded handwriting with her thumb, imagining the disappointment behind each line, the hope that eroded every time a machine stopped short of revealing a name. She turned toward the sequencing platform, sleek, state-of-the-art, far more precise than anything available when the case was new. It could take fragments, even badly degraded ones, and rebuild them into something readable. Not perfect, but enough for the new world of genetic genealogy, a field that had transformed the meaning of cold case. Neera exhaled slowly. Let's see what you've been holding all these years. She worked in silence, letting her motions become the language of the moment. She prepared the sample, drew out the preserved material from the cotton swabs, transferred what she needed into small clear tubes, and placed them into the extraction unit. The machine clicked and whirred with soft precision, performing tasks that once required entire laboratory teams. 3 hours later, the sequencing platform lit up with its gentle blue glow. The progress bar moved steadily, converting decades-old biological fragments into a single digital profile. Neera leaned forward as the system processed the data, her breath barely audible. When the monitor displayed the final line, "Profile complete," she felt a tremor move through her chest. She uploaded the file to the genealogical analysis portal. The algorithm spread across the screen like branches growing in fast forward. It compared the new profile against vast databases of public genetic information, cross-checking the sequences with records, archives, and family trees. At first, nothing appeared. Then a single distant match blinked into existence. A third cousin, then a second cousin, then another. The branches tightened, clustering around a single extended family originating in Red Willow County. Neera's pulse quickened. She narrowed the parameters, filtering for age, location, and male lineage. One name began to separate from the others: Caleb Mercer. Age 52. Born in Maple Crossing. Employed for decades in building maintenance across multiple properties, apartment complexes, student housing, older rental units scattered across the county. The kind of man who had access to places without drawing notice. The kind of man who carried keys. Neera stared at the profile information, the weight of it settling in her bones. She checked the system again, then again, verifying every number, every bracket, every statistical probability. The likelihood was overwhelming. The DNA that had been silent for 30 years had finally spoken. She reached for the phone. Detective Mara Ellison arrived at the lab within 20 minutes. She wore a coat speckled with early spring drizzle and carried the tension of someone bracing for news she had both hoped for and feared might never come. Neera handed her the printed genealogical report pages of family branches funneling down to a single name. Mara read slowly, her eyes widening with each line. Maintenance supervisor, she murmured. Student housing. Rental units. He was everywhere, Neera nodded. And he lived in Maple Crossing the entire time. They sat with the truth in a moment of heavy silence. Mara traced her finger along the printed family tree, stopping at the highlighted name. It felt surreal, how something so devastating could lie hidden behind an ordinary job title and a familiar hometown. Do we have a way to verify? Mara asked. We need a fresh sample, Neera replied. But the genealogy is extremely strong. He fits in every possible parameter. Then let's get his DNA. Surveillance began quietly. Officers watched Mercer's routines, arriving early to campus housing units, carrying toolboxes and clipboards, greeting students without ever drawing suspicion. He fit the role almost too well. Polite, helpful, the type of person people trusted with broken locks and stuck windows. One morning, after Mercer finished his shift and tossed his empty coffee cup into a trash bin near the parking lot, detectives retrieved it within minutes. The cup was sent straight to Neera. The hours that followed felt endless. Then the screen displayed the result. Full match to 1992 sample. No margin of doubt, no ambiguity. A perfect overlay of genetic markers, decades spanned in a single line of certainty. Mara closed her eyes, feeling something inside her unclench, something that had been wound tight long before she ever took this case. When she opened them again, they shone with steadiness. Call the chief, she said. We're moving. The arrest was calm, almost too calm. Mercer was stepping out of his truck, adjusting his jacket, when officers approached. He didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He simply froze, his hand resting on the loop of keys at his belt. The keys jingled softly as they were removed, tagged and bagged metal pieces that had opened too many doors too quietly. Back at the lab, Neera logged the confirmation sample, labeling it with the date and time. The original evidence envelope lay open beside her, the handwriting from 1992 still visible. Park 92. She touched the edge of the paper gently, as if acknowledging the decades of silence it had held. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the department. Roswell, long since moved to another unit, walked into Mara's office without knocking. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, but in that moment he looked younger, lighter. You got him, he said, almost whispering. We did, Mara replied. Science did. Elena received the news at home, sitting at the kitchen table with her mother. The phone call was short. The detective's voice was steady and careful. When she heard Mercer's name for the first time, She felt nothing at first, no shock, no recognition. Just the immense and unfamiliar feeling of something long frozen beginning to thaw. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena exhaled, a long breath that carried decades of weight with it. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask how he was found. She only said, "Thank you," because there were no other words large enough for that moment. Across Maple Crossing, reactions rippled through the community. Neighbors who once exchanged hellos with Mercer felt the ground shift beneath their memories. People questioned old conversations, old interactions, old routines. The idea that he had blended so seamlessly into their lives felt like a wound reopening. But alongside the shock was something else: relief. A quiet, powerful release of fear that had lingered in the corners of the town for years. At the lab, Nura prepared a final set of reports. She placed the original evidence envelope into a new box, sealed and labeled with the updated file number. Before closing it, she added a small note on top. "Solved by genetic genealogy, 2021. She closed the lid gently. Justice, long delayed, had finally found its way through the narrowest channel of science and time. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning of the arraignment dawned with a brittle kind of cold, the kind that leaves frost tracing delicate lines along the courthouse windows. People gathered slowly, hesitantly, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of justice or the reopening of something they had long buried. Officers escorted Caleb Mercer through a side entrance, his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him, the chain clinking faintly as he walked. His face was composed, almost blank, carrying the same expression he had worn the day of his arrest, neither remorse nor defiance, just an unsettling calm. Detective Mara Ellison followed several steps behind, not out of necessity, but because she needed to see him there, contained, no longer moving freely through the hallways and neighborhoods he once navigated without suspicion. Roswell stood near the metal detector, hands folded, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and something darker, the ache of time lost, years spent chasing a ghost when the man had been right there all along. Inside the first courtroom, the benches filled quickly. A hush settled over the space as the judge entered, and the air felt charged with a collective breath held too long. Mercer's attorney read out preliminary pleas, requesting delays, contesting procedural elements, doing what defense attorneys do, but the prosecution countered with the clarity of the DNA match. There was no space for ambiguity, no shadow of doubt to hide beneath. When the judge denied bail, a ripple of quiet relief moved through the observers like a soft tide. Mercer was led away again, hands still calm, posture unchanged. But those watching noticed something in the way his eyes drifted toward the floor, as if the weight of certainty had finally begun to settle across his shoulders. The trial began 6 months later, in a larger courtroom chosen to accommodate victims, families, reporters, and curious locals who needed to witness the arc of justice after so many dormant years. The courthouse had been renovated since the 90s, but its bones remained the same. Wooden benches smoothed from decades of use, pale walls that carried every whisper farther than expected, and high windows that poured winter light onto the polished floor like silent testimony. Elena entered through a private side passage, escorted by an advocate who had worked with her for years. She moved quietly, carrying herself with a steadiness hard-won over time. Her mother sat beside her, hands folded tightly, her silver hair pulled back in a way that revealed the soft lines time had carved across her face. When they looked toward the defense table, neither flinched nor lingered. The man seated there was simply a figure, one whose presence had altered their lives, whose name they had learned only through science. As testimony began, the prosecution laid out the timeline with clinical precision: the preserved evidence, the modern DNA sequencing, the genealogical analysis, the confirmation sample from the discarded coffee cup. Charts and documents were entered into the record, each piece building on the last until the narrative stood undeniable. Nira Vance took the stand, her voice steady as she explained the process, her calm confidence illuminating the gulf between old technology and modern capability. Her description of the DNA match left the courtroom in a collective stillness. The defense questioned her methods, searching for weakness. She answered patiently, thoroughly, never wavering. In the end, the jury watched her with the kind of attention reserved for those whose clarity changes the course of a story. When Alina took the stand, the room seemed to shrink around her. She spoke softly, halting at times, but her words carried the weight of lived truth. She did not describe graphic details. She spoke of the loss of trust, loss of safety, loss of the person she once was. She described the years after, the nights she checked the locks 3 times, the way her world narrowed to manageable distances, the moments when she thought she might never feel whole again. The defense attorney attempted gentle questions, trying to suggest her memory might be unreliable after so long. Alina looked at him with quiet firmness. "I may not remember everything from that night," she said, "but I know what it did to me. And I know that the man who did it thought he would never be found." Her words lingered, suspended in the courtroom silence. Other survivors testified, 2 women from nearby towns, whose experiences echoed hers in unsettling detail. Their voices interlaced, forming a tapestry of fear and resilience that no cross-examination could unravel. Patterns emerged in the testimony: the calm voice, the sense of familiarity in the dark, the presence of someone who moved with ease through unfamiliar rooms. The prosecution then called experts to tie those patterns to Mercer's years of employment. Maintenance logs, apartment repair records, and long-forgotten service slips appeared on the projection screen. Dates aligned ominously with the timelines of the assaults. Properties where women lived and later reported incidents matched locations where Mercer had been assigned work, sometimes weeks before, sometimes days. One maintenance log scrawled in Mercer's handwriting described fixing a backdoor latch 2 weeks before a victim's assault. Another detailed replacing a lock cylinder for a tenant who later reported missing keys. These records, mundane when written, now framed a chilling outline of opportunity and access. Through it all, Mercer sat still. He rarely spoke to his attorney. He never looked toward the prosecution table. But occasionally, when a witness described the feeling of waking in the dark to the presence of someone they did not understand, his jaw tightened, tiny flickers of tension that betrayed the mask he had worn for decades. Closing arguments arrived like the final chord of a long, dissonant symphony. The prosecution spoke of betrayal in plain sight, of a man who used ordinary trust as camouflage, who walked through homes with tools meant for repair but used for intrusion. They spoke of science as the final lantern illuminating what time tried to obscure. The defense leaned heavily on the passage of years, on the fragility of memory, on the absence of direct visual identification. But the DNA match, unshakable and precise, stood like a cornerstone in the center of the case. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom filled to capacity. People stood along the walls, breathing quietly, waiting. Alina held her mother's hand. Mara sat behind them, eyes fixed on the foreperson. Roswell watched from a corner seat, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. The verdict was spoken clearly, each word landing with the weight of years. Guilty on all counts. A wave of emotion passed through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like the first exhale after being held under water too long. Alina closed her eyes. Her mother pressed her forehead against their joined hands. An advocate behind them wiped away a quiet tear. Mercer remained still, but the tension in his face settled into something like resignation. For the first time, he glanced at the key ring sitting on the prosecution table among the evidence exhibits, and something inside him seemed to fold. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge read the counts, outlined the impact, repeated the scientific certainty, and delivered a sentence that ensured Mercer would never walk freely through another hallway, never hold another key that did not belong to him. When the session ended and the courtroom emptied, Mara found herself standing alone near the bench. She looked at the empty seat where Mercer had sat and felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that justice had arrived, sorrow for the years lost to silence. Roswell joined her, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "It's done," he said. "Not everything," she replied softly. "But enough." Across town, news of the verdict spread. Neighbors talked quietly on porches. Former tenants revisited memories they had tucked away. The florist lit a candle in their window. At the community center, Elena walked the halls with a lighter step, not healed in an instant, but changed, carrying a new kind of breath, a space where fear had once lived. Justice didn't erase the past, but it opened the door to a different future, one where silence no longer held the final word. In the months after the verdict, Maple Crossing settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the uneasy stillness that had lingered all those years, but a gentler calm, shaped by the knowledge that a shadow once woven through the town's routines had finally been named and removed. People walked their neighborhoods with steadier steps. Porch lights stayed lit not out of fear, but out of habit. And in homes across Red Willow County, a breath long held was slowly released. Elena's life didn't transform overnight, but something in her posture eased. She continued working at the community center, but now she stayed later, talking with coworkers, helping teenagers with homework, allowing herself moments of laughter that once felt too fragile to risk. The townhouse she had chosen years ago began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. She kept the green ceramic key hook on her desk, no longer a symbol of what was taken, but of what she reclaimed, a reminder that her world had expanded again. Her mother watched her with quiet gratitude. There were still difficult days, moments when memories brushed too close, but there was also progress she could see, a softened expression, a deeper breath, a new willingness to look toward the future. Sometimes Elena would sit with her in the living room, the two of them watching the river reports on the local news, listening to the seasonal forecasts, comfortable in a silence that no longer felt heavy. Detective Mara Ellison returned to her other cases, but she carried this one with her differently now. She boxed up the photocopies, archived the reports, and placed the genealogical chart into a file that would become part of the department's training materials. She knew new officers would study it someday, learning how science had given voice to a case once thought unsolvable. Funny how something as small as a decades-old swab could shape the future of investigative work. Roswell retired the following year. On his last day, he walked through the evidence room one more time, pausing at the shelf where the old box had once gathered dust. It now held a new label, marked closed. He touched the edge of the shelf lightly before turning off the lights. For the first time in years, he walked out of the building without feeling the weight of something unfinished at his back. Across Maple Crossing, conversations about safety shifted. People talked about vigilance without fear, awareness without paranoia. Schools incorporated new programs about community watchfulness. The tire plant added better lighting to its parking lot. The college installed security upgrades in older housing units, locks that couldn't be quietly mimicked, windows that didn't slide free so easily. Yet the town did not live in the past, it honored it. That was different. As spring approached, the river swelled with melting snow, carrying bits of driftwood and early blossoms along its surface. Elena walked the path one morning, the same path she had avoided years ago, and paused at a bend where the branches of a large oak reached toward the water. The air was cool, but the sun warmed her face. For a moment she closed her eyes, listening to the soft rush of water, allowing herself to feel present instead of guarded. In her pocket, she carried a small key, not the original, but one she'd chosen intentionally. It opened nothing important, nothing vulnerable. She'd bought it from a hardware store simply because it had a teal enamel finish that reminded her of the ceramic hook. She held it between her fingers for a moment, letting it warm in her palm before slipping it back. A symbol, not of entry, but of autonomy. The legacy of the case lived in subtler places than headlines or court records. It lived in the sharper instincts of the next generation of officers, in the strengthened bonds between neighbors, in the resilience of families who endured profound uncertainty. It lived in the simple truth that justice, no matter how delayed, had found its way through the narrow corridor of time. And in that truth was something healing. The weather finally turned warmer. Blossoms appeared along the sidewalks. The florist beneath her old apartment placed buckets of tulips outside, their colors bright and hopeful. Standing across the street, Alina watched the shop owner arrange the flowers, smiling faintly at the familiarity of the scene. Life had moved forward. She had too. Justice had not erased the past, but it had lifted the weight of not knowing, allowing room for something else to grow: quiet certainty, steady breath, and the fragile, persistent shape of hope. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.